We concluded the course by thinking about macroeconomics, where we treat the economy as a single system rather than thinking about it in parts as we did in microeconomics. Now, there are lots of equations that we could pull out of this circular flow diagram, but by far the most important are the two equilibrium equations. One arises from the output market, where in equilibrium what's being produced has to be equal to what's being purchased. What's being produced is GDP. What's being purchased is what flows through these output markets: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. The second equilibrium equation emerged on the right-hand side of the diagram through financial markets. What flows into financial markets must in equilibrium be equal to what flows out. What flows in is household and government savings, which sum to what we call domestic savings. What flows out is investment and net exports, so domestic savings has to be equal to investment plus net exports. Now, when we first started talking about macroeconomics, everything was about the short run. And the first model we developed was based entirely on this equilibrium condition. That equilibrium condition says that purchases have to be equal to production in equilibrium. So if we put production on this axis, GDP, and purchases on this axis, if they have to be equal to each other, equilibrium must lie on the 45-degree line. Then we came up with some behavioral equations to describe consumption behavior, investment behavior, and net export behavior as income in the economy changes. And the sum of that, plus the exogenous level of government purchases, gave us our aggregate expenditure curve. In equilibrium, aggregate expenditures on purchases have to be equal to production, so we have to be on this 45-degree line, which gave us our first macroeconomic equilibrium. The problem with that equilibrium was that it held prices fixed. It was an extreme version of a sticky prices model. So now we wanted to ask, well, what's the role of prices? We came up with another graph with GDP on this axis and the price level on this axis. And we derived what we call the aggregate demand curve from the upper graph by varying prices and seeing where the equilibrium would emerge in the upper graph as aggregate expenditures shift. So the aggregate demand curve told us the equilibrium level of GDP at different price levels in the economy. We then came up with the idea of a natural level of GDP, the level of GDP at full employment. And in the long run, the economy always returns to that natural level of GDP, so we got a perfectly vertical aggregate supply curve in the long run. But in the short run, we said prices could be sticky, particularly when we get below the natural level of GDP. So we got this relatively flat portion for the aggregate supply curve in the short run, leading up to that natural level of GDP, and then becoming quickly steeper as it gets hard to produce above the natural level. So now we had a short run aggregate supply curve. Now we could use that model to think about recessions and expansions, and particularly to think about how policy can shift aggregate demand and influence recoveries from recessions, or even push output above the natural level of GDP. There were two kinds of policies that could do that: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy simply operates through government spending and taxing, and as the government spends more and taxes less, aggregate demand shifts out, and we call that an expansionary policy. When it does the opposite, it's a contractionary policy and shifts the aggregate demand curve in the other direction. Then, as we worked our way up to monetary policy, we talked about money, what money is, currency plus demand deposits, and how money is created through the banking system. And then we introduced the Federal Reserve, or the central bank, that influences financial markets through its actions, and through its influence on financial markets tries to have an impact on the whole economy, at least in the short run. Expansionary monetary policy shifts the aggregate demand curve out by increasing the money supply. And then we talked about a transmission mechanism that transmits the impact of that through the economy in the short run. Or it can engage in contractionary monetary policy that shifts aggregate demand in the other direction. Now this flat portion of aggregate supply was entirely due to the assumption of sticky prices. The assumption that in the short run, markets don't fully adjust, and so equilibrium prices don't fully emerge in markets, and prices are sticky. Then when we talked about pushing production beyond the natural level of GDP, we saw that that would give rise to price increases, to inflation. And so it got us to thinking about inflation and inflation expectations as we thought about the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve, which illustrates a short-run trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation. You can push the unemployment rate below the natural level, but at the cost of inflation, and as we saw, at the cost of permanently higher inflation, because inflation expectations adjust and get built into the system. So we can push production beyond the natural level, but at the cost of permanently higher inflation. We used in that process the concept of adaptive expectations. The fact that expectations may not adjust fully in the short run, but may take time to adjust and may therefore not be fully rational in the short run. And we saw that the more rational expectations get, the closer the short-run Phillips curves get to the perfectly vertical long-run Phillips curve. And the less possibility there is for government to actually push production above the natural level. Then we talked about the intermediate run. In the intermediate run, we no longer think about business cycles, because we now look at a period of 5 to 10 years where the economy has settled to the natural level of GDP. We no longer think about sticky prices because we think markets are clearing. And we no longer think about adaptive expectations because expectations will settle over that period. We found that money is neutral over that period. There's no role for monetary policy. And instead, our entire focus was on thinking about what explains the shares of GDP that go to consumption, government purchases, investment, and net exports in the intermediate run. There we found that the real interest rate is the crucial variable that equilibrates things in the intermediate run. And to do that, we use that second equilibrium equation to literally derive an economy-wide demand and supply curve that set the interest rate, the real interest rate. Finally, we talked about the long run, where in the long run, we're concerned about economic growth, and we developed the solo growth model. Now, throughout the course, we had another theme, and that theme revolved around causal inference. At the very beginning of the course, we said that while all economists share a basic toolkit, the kind of toolkit that we've developed in Econ 101 and beyond that, what most economists do most of the time is test models to see to what extent they're useful in the real world in making predictions. The way we test models is we use econometrics, and much of econometrics is about causal inference. We said there were two approaches: the reduced form approach that builds directly on the randomized controlled experiment. There was a fundamental problem of causal inference, which was that we couldn't observe the counterfactual. But through the randomized controlled experiment, we can identify what we called average treatment effects. But we also know that in economics and other social sciences, we often don't have the luxury of running randomized controlled experiments. Instead, we get data from the real world and we look for natural experiments, where those natural experiments often have confounders. So the trick then is to figure out a way to adjust for the presence of those confounders and recover what the average treatment effects would have been had we been able to run the randomized controlled experiment. So we had a number of examples throughout the course where we used reduced form approaches to think about testing economic theories. But we also said there was a structural approach. The structural approach starts by creating a model, using the tools of economic theory to create a model, and then feeding some data into that model so that the model can become empirically relevant, can predict how the world actually is. Once we have that model, we can rerun it and simulate what a policy might do. We can simulate a counterfactual, or what a policy might have done by taking the policy out of the model and seeing what would have happened had we not had a policy we actually implemented. And that structural approach is the dominant approach when we think about macroeconomics. We're thinking about a whole system, so we have to model that whole system. That's a structural model. And then we use that structural model to create counterfactuals, to ask questions like, what would happen if the government spent more? What would happen in the short run, in the intermediate run, or in the long run? What would happen if we changed tax policy? What would happen if we hadn't put in a stimulus and we had just let the recession run its course? So those are the kinds of questions we can ask using the structural approach, and that is an approach that is oftentimes used in macroeconomics.